Controversial, tragic, embarrassing, groundbreaking. If you were to describe the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix using any of those words, you wouldn't be wrong. But if you were to only use one of those words, you'd be selling its story short. That weekend has gone down in history as one of the most complex in all of F1. Only fitting then that we cover it in this series. Welcome to 70s Tales episode 6, Overshadowed Accomplishments. Hello everyone and a warm welcome back to the series. My name's Ben Hocking and this is episode 6 of 70s Tales, the last one of the season. Thank you so much for joining me throughout this trek back in time, and I hope you've had a lot of fun exploring some of these tales. I hope you enjoy today's video. The 1975 Spanish Grand Prix was to be round 4 of the 1975 championship, and even before the race weekend got started, there was the potential for a controversial weekend. Drivers being unhappy about circuit conditions wasn't a new concept. You could almost call it regular in the late 60s and early 70s, and there were those that were concerned before the circus even arrived at the circuit. The circuit in question here is the Montjuic circuit in Barcelona, named after the Montjuic mountain it was situated on. Much like other European Grand Prix of the time, Spain alternated the venues. Montjuic hosted on odd years, and Jaume in Madrid hosted in even years. 1975 was set to be the 4th Spanish GP held at Montjuic. It's tough to describe the Montjuic circuit. If anything, it's best described as a perfect representation of what F1 was in the 1970s. It was fast, dangerous, and required an immense amount of courage and commitment. Conversely, it was picturesque beyond belief, perhaps even more so than Monaco. Glitz, glamour, and peril at every corner. It was a 1970s circuit in every possible way. When it came onto the calendar in 1969, in terms of danger it was far from out of the ordinary, but the early 70s had seen a lot of circuits improve, and those not willing, or able to improve, disappear from the calendar. So by the time 1975 rolled around, safety standards were at a higher mark. The teams turned up in Barcelona. Normally they would squeeze all of the cars and equipment into the gardens behind the pits, but a strange decision considering there was a massive stadium right around the corner that was originally built for the 1936 Olympics. So sense finally prevailed in 1975 and they stored their cars in the stadium. That might seem a strange and irrelevant point to make, but it will become very important soon enough. Friday practice started at 2 p.m. local time, but with one massive problem. The drivers were all on the circuit, just not in the cars. The fears of the drivers were being realised. The circuit was not in a good state to race. The guardrails and debris nets were present and in the right place, but were horribly fixed. Badly fitted bolts in some cases, no bolts whatsoever in others, rails not attached to uprights. The work done was shoddy and utterly unacceptable to the drivers. They went away and held a GDPA meeting, even including those who weren't GDPA members of the time. The drivers were on strike and a standoff ensued. The loyalties of the drivers were being put to the test. Stay loyal to your fellow drivers and the GDPA, or stay loyal to the team where you held a contract to go racing. The bulk of the drivers, led by de facto locker room leader Emerson Fittipaldi, stood firm throughout Friday practice, with only 2 drivers deviating from the norm. Jackie Ickx in his Lotus and Vittorio Brambilla in the March both set some medium speed laps, but that was it. The stalemate continued on into the evening, with a compromise from both sides seemingly the only way to move forward. The organisers desperately needed a race to happen, preferably with all drivers there, and the drivers would not race on the circuit in its current state. Even if the organisers wanted to completely lie down and let the drivers have their way, the reality of this was unfeasible with such little time to spare. Across Friday evening, organisers made some inroads into the mammoth task, but come Saturday morning the improvements were nowhere near enough, and the drivers remained adamant the race needed to be cancelled. Understanding the workforce was not enough to make substantial changes to the adequacy of the circuit, several team members adopted the "if you want a job done properly, do it yourself" line of thinking. Members of all teams, including the likes of Colin Chapman and Ken Tyrrell, went around the circuit making improvements. The result was not perfect, but the FIA stewards believed that enough had been done for the drivers to get out there and start racing. The drivers, though, remained unmoved. The organisers at this point were, unsurprisingly, pretty desperate. Time was running out fast, and realistically, this was as good as it was going to get for the drivers. The organisers had one trick left up their sleeve, one that they had declined to use to this point, but desperate times call for desperate measures. The ultimatum was given: honour your contractual commitment or face legal action. In most circumstances, the drivers and the teams would at least have some sort of leverage here. Bring on your legal action, we can take the hit and move on to another race weekend where we think safety is satisfactory. Thank you and goodbye. However, this time around they didn't have such a luxury. Remember where the cars were being held? In that massive sports stadium. If the drivers refused to race, the Spanish authorities could lock up that stadium in minutes, leaving all of the cars trapped inside until legal action was taken. This wasn't the something that the teams and the sport could afford. The teams knew they were backed into a corner and demanded that the drivers went out and honoured their contracts. Threats of cancelling contracts were thrown around, and soon enough, all of the drivers were in their race suits and hopping into their cars. Most drivers resumed as if nothing had happened, lapping at the pace you would expect them to. Niki Lauda secured pole position with a 1:23.4, 1/10 ahead of his teammate Clay Regazzoni. Emerson Fittipaldi, seen as the ringleader in all of this, received nothing but jeers from the Spanish crowd. Despite everyone else gunning for pole, Fittipaldi was doing nothing of the sport, driving around at a leisurely pace. His fastest lap clocked in at 2 minutes and 10 seconds. The two-time champ and championship leader was not happy about being forced to go racing, and the dismay of the Spanish fans was nowhere near enough to convince him to give it his all. The sighter laps did nothing to change his mind, and after practice finished on Saturday, he went home to Switzerland, refusing to take part in the race. He was, however, the only one who did so a race was still on for Sunday. The Ferraris were on the front row for the race and led down into turn 1, but Andretti behind had also got a very good start and tangled with Lauda. The contact forced Lauda into the path of his teammate, and just like that, Ferrari's 1-2 had turned into disaster. Lauda was out on the spot, Regazzoni limped back to the pits but was 4 laps down before he rejoined. The chaotic start saw James Hunt take the lead in his Hesketh. The race proved to be one of attrition, with the retirements quickly piling up. Jody Scheckter was out after his engine blew up, and the ensuing oil accounted for 3 retirements, including race leader Hunt. This left Andretti in the lead until his turn 1 incident came back to bite. The suspension, previously dent but usable, fully broke. The retirements carried on until over half the field were no longer in the race. The retirements of Hunt and Andretti left unlikely Rolf Stommelen in the lead of the race, the first time that this was the case. Lap 26 started, Stommelen in the lead, Carlos Pache chasing him, but little did they know that this was to be one of the most tragic laps in motorsport history. Stommelen's rear wing came off at 150 miles per hour. As a result, the car veered left into a barrier, which then caused the car to rebound across the track to the right-hand side. With the momentum the car had, this was enough to see Stommelen and his wrecked vehicle go above the Armco barrier and amongst a group of spectators. 5 members of the public were killed. Stommelen survived, but not without significant injury. 2 broken legs, 2 broken ribs, and a broken wrist. In bizarre irony, Stommelen made contact with the guardrail that his own team had done work on the day before. The barrier itself stood up to the contact, and the potential consequences if this work had not been done could have been even more catastrophic. Bewilderingly, the race actually continued on for an extra 4 laps, with Jochen Mass taking the hollow victory, with half points being awarded. 2 notable accomplishments were sadly overshadowed by the tragic events of this day. Mass's victory was his first, and he admitted that he understandably felt no jubilation in what should have been a jubilant occasion. For the rest of the year, and indeed his career, he searched for a win that would be his first true victory, but it was to no avail. His first win would be his only win. Rounding out in the points in 6th was Lella Lombardi, thus becoming the first woman to achieve a point-scoring finish in Formula 1 history. 45 years later, this remains the only time this has happened. Lombardi's achievement was monumental, but again, cruelly overshadowed by tragedy and messy politics. The Spanish Grand Prix would continue, but not on Montjuic. That fateful day in 1975 proving to be the last time that F1 cars would lap the iconic street circuit. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do subscribe for future content and leave a like and a comment. This was the final episode of Season 1. If you've missed any of the previous 5 episodes, do go back and check them out. As for whether there will be a Season 2, we'll see. Until next time, keep braking late.